Hello, and welcome to this week's Ethical Dilemma in Science, where we're going to look into the question of reintroduction of gray wolves and think about how are we promoting ecological balance or we protecting a predator. And so, get my slides moving. So this is an article that came out earlier this week, came out February 10th, 2022. Wolves regain federal protection in much of the United States. So what does that mean? What is the impact of what it is that we're going to be talking about? And so, from this, again, recent articles kind of related to this. It looks like a U.S. Today report, amazing creatures, protections of gray wolves restored across much of the U.S., looking very favorable at the outcome of this. But then at the other side over here, gray wolves attacks keep North Colorado town on edge. We're their grocery store, coming from, less than 2 weeks ago. What's going on with all of this? What is the information? What is the controversy of what it is that we're looking at? So in order to understand what is the importance of, the biological question, the reintroduction of gray wolves, we've got to look at the way in which the wolves are going to be interacting within their environment. And so what we can see is that wolves are a natural predator. And as a natural predator, they're going to feed upon and prey upon other organisms. And so one of their primary targets are these elks within the elk population. Let's take a look primarily at Yellowstone. And so the wolves will eat the elves. The elves are basically herbivores. They're going to be grazers. They're going to go through and they're going to eat plants. And by eating these plants, they're going to keep it, a little bit, controlled. They're going to feed upon it. In this case, the plants are going to be referred to as producers. They're going to be doing photosynthesis. They're going to provide energy in the form of sugar and foods for this entire ecosystem. And so if we've got a healthy ecosystem, again, focused in on Yellowstone National Park, we've got a number of wolves that are going to be present. The wolves feed upon the elk, and the elk feed upon the, say, willow plants here, the willow trees, and basically control their growth. But with the presence of wolves, we've got kind of a control on the level of elk that are going to be present. And because of that, we've got some kind of robust growth of these willow trees in this point. Now, following the 1920s upwards to about the 1990s, there was an effort to eliminate the wolf population from much of the American West, eliminate it from Yellowstone National Park. And at that point, what happened is without the predators to feed upon the elk populations grew. And as the elk populations grew, they needed more food. And so that more food was going to come from eating more and more of the willow trees. And in doing so, they're going to cause these kind of what used to be robust willow trees that were present, that could be used by the beavers to kind of establish their dams and the communities built around the dams. The elk were overgrazing these bushes, overgrazing these willow trees, and they were growing back, limiting the resources available to other organisms within the system, other living creatures, as well as limiting the amount of raw materials for the beavers to be able to build their dams. With the reintroduction of wolves, starting about 1995, we've seen that they've been able to control the elk population, at least as the wolves were introduced, the elk population reduced, and we're starting to see kind of a return to the kind of pre-1920 levels of many of the other organisms, including the willow trees. Now, it's one thing to say this, it's another thing to look at the data that goes along with it. And so this is from a scientific paper that came out in 2012. So we can see the wolf population here starting out at basically zero, kind of growing up and getting more and more. So this would be the presence of wolves within this area. So we're seeing more and more of them. Sometimes they kind of die off, they rebound, kind of die off here. Again, paper is about 10 years old now at this point. And we take a look at the elk population. And so with this elk population, we can see that once the wolves have been reintroduced, the elk population are basically becoming food for the wolves. We're seeing them start to decrease. As we do this, we start to see the effects of browsing, the elk feeding upon these willow and aspen trees, we're going to see that they start to grow. And so this is aspen trees kind of growing in the presence of this reduced grazing. We've got willow trees over here that are rebounding as well. Taking a look at cottonwoods, all of these things are growing. So it's having a positive effect. And we can take a look at that. Again, a related paper to this. Actually, no, I think this is in the same paper. The related paper is on the next slide. We can see that, about 10 years after the reintroduction of the wolves, we got a research scientist out here standing with probably a 2-meter high stick. And you can see that, we've got low brush that has been growing out here as the kind of impact, as the outcome of the reduced grazing that was being present. A short 4 years later, here's that same researcher, that same 2-meter high stick, and you can see that that undergrowth has grown much more dense. It's providing lots of cover for other organisms to grow. So we've seen the effects of the reduction of the elk population. Now, this is from this is from a National Geographic article, which shows, in the absence of the wolves, we've got the elk grazing here, overgrazing in many areas, and exposing the soil, you can see kind of long distances, eliminating some of those protective areas where other smaller living organisms are capable of living. In this case, with the reintroduction of the wolves kind of artistically represented here, we've got a reduction in the elk, and we're starting to see kind of growth of the plants, the shrubs, the trees kind of along these areas, decreasing the amount of erosion that's occurring, and we're starting to see kind of a return of other species that are able to kind of live in the areas established by the beaver dams. They're able to live in the areas that are created and protected by the increased shrubbery that is going to be present. And this is the other paper that I was thinking to look at. So instead of just the National Geographic artist rendition, here's, again, I think it's the same scientist, it looks like the same hat being present, taking a look at 2 different regions within Yellowstone National Park. Here we've got an area that has been fairly robustly grazed, probably overgrazed at this point, and you see, not a lot of bushes, not a lot of low shrubs, and you can see for a very long distance as we see there. If we are a predator looking to eat a squirrel or a rabbit or some other small creature, we can see it pretty far off, and they don't really have a lot of places to hide, and therefore the predators can attack the prey animals, the smaller animals that are being present. In an area where this grazing isn't as pronounced, we see the kind of establishment of a good, strong kind of undergrowth, these shrubs and bushes that are being present here. And this provides a great location for birds to live. It's a great location for smaller living organisms to kind of have their dens and be protected from predators, being protected from being eaten in ultimately in this. And so what we're seeing is the effect of reduction of this elk population through the reintroduction of wolves. Now, there are a lot of arguments saying that this reintroduction of wolves is not the end-all and be-all of reestablishing a natural ecosystem within the American West, within Yellowstone National Park. And we have to admit that the simple reintroduction of wolves is making things better in terms of the natural ecology, the natural balance that is present within these regions. But it's incredibly more complicated than that. This is an image showing a simple version of the kind of interrelationships between living organisms. And so we've got, producers down here, plants that are doing photosynthesis, that are providing food for organisms within that region. Then we've got a bunch of grazers here. These are going to be, first level consumers that are like herbivores. They're going to go through and they're going to graze upon the plants. So these are, primarily plant-eating organisms, but they provide food for these carnivores up here, these higher-level consumers that are going to be, forms of predators. And so, the presence of these predators limits the size of the population, the number of individuals of these organisms that are eating on the plants, and so we can see kind of a rebound of the plants occurring. Now, each one of these lines indicates that this organism has an impact on the next organisms over here. So we can see that instead of just a simple line of, gray wolves to elk to, some of these aspens or these willows that we're taking a look at, it's a lot more complicated. We got a lot more organisms that are being present. And the wolves are just a part of this kind of restoration process. So the question becomes, or at least a question becomes, what should the long-term goal of the Endangered Species Act be? We're looking at the fact that we are now protecting the gray wolves that had been delisted from the Endangered Species Act and allowed to be hunted outside of the parks. And so what is the long-term goal of the Endangered Species Act? Should it be to simply preserve the survival of the species? So we take them out of their natural environment and we put them into zoos or wild animal parks so that they survive, so that they're not lost forever, but we can go and see them in this kind of artificial environment. Should the long-term goal of the Endangered Species Act be to preserve the species so that it doesn't go extinct in the wild? So we establish things like natural preserves or national parks where these organisms can kind of live and, not quite a zoo, they're still in a protected area, but it's more of a natural environment being present. Or, should a long-term goal of the Endangered Species Act be to restore the species to its environmental role within their natural ecosystem? So kind of turn the clock back and try to go back to a more natural time where human intervention into the environment wasn't as prevalent as what we've seen over the last 100, 150 years in the American West. Now, we can see the advantages, for biologists, for scientists like me, to see, let's reintroduce the wolves to areas like the Yellowstone National Park. And we take a look at this and we balance out the risks versus the benefits of having a wolf population being present within these areas. And so this is a map from the American West. So insert here kind of in the northern kind of western states, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, kind of that region. We've got Yellowstone National Park kind of sitting here kind of at that juncture between Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. Got another nature preserve kind of over here. So we can see that the wolves that were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park have not stopped at the boundaries of the national park. They've expanded out. So each one of these little brown dots represents a wolf population in the American West. And so they've been reestablished kind of out here. But they're outside of that protected area. They're outside of Yellowstone National Park. And to be honest, they're outside of the area where they've been protected to become reestablished. And if we take a look at this, the presence of wolves in the wild remains controversial. We take a look at, Grimm's fairy tales, which, start out as, today are children's stories, but started out as, warnings to the population, warnings to children to, don't play with wolves, be careful when you go out into the woods. You got the Little Red Riding Hood and the wolf. And the wolf, attacks grandma and eats her, and then attempts to attack Little Red Riding Hood. So that's not a good idea. Three Little Pigs and the Big Bad Wolf. Looking at the situation that the wolf is going through and terrorizing the Three Little Pigs. And so there's this danger associated with the presence of wolves. And so when we take a look at this, again, outside of these protected areas, one of the big concerns is the impact that the wolves would have on livestock. There are concerns that the wolves would have, on suburban or rural neighborhoods where you have people living, with pets and with, human attacks by the wolves. And in general, they're going to be relatively rare, but they do occur. Lots of arguments against the reintroduction of wolves associated with attacks on livestock. And so I pulled the data from the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, where they've taken a look at what has happened to cattle. And so on the left-hand slide, what we've got here is taking a look at all of the cattle population from 1996 to 2016. The gray bar is the cattle that remained living at the end of the year. The orange bar is the cattle that are lost to non-predation, and so non-predators. This would be like, disease loss. And then the blue, which you can barely see kind of at the top of this, is due to predator loss. So, organisms attacking the livestock. And it's hard to see because, we're looking at a relatively small percentage of the population being lost. And so this slide over here, or the graph over here on the right-hand portion of the slide, is taking a look at basically from 98% to 100. And so we're looking at this little sliver of the information up here. And you can see, again, the gray, kind of the extension of the cattle that are surviving, the orange, which is, loss of cattle to disease, and blue, which is going to be loss to predation. And so we can see that, there are cattle that are lost every year to predation within this report. They were saying that, up to 40% of cattle operations had lost cattle to predators. So it's not, a rare thing. It's not something that never occurs. And it's actually, it's increased over the time that wolves have been reintroduced. But it still remains a relatively small portion of the total cattle that are out west. Now, keep in mind, a relatively small portion means that we're still talking about millions and millions of dollars of loss associated with this. And there are mechanisms in place in which ranchers who have lost livestock to wolf predation are able to be compensated, but there are arguments that the compensation isn't enough, and it's difficult in many cases to prove that the wolves attacked the cattle as opposed to, maybe wild dogs or some other organism as well. And so the question then be, should wolves and livestock have different levels of protection based on the location? So should wolves be protected within our national parks and protected natural areas where we've limited the ability of livestock to graze within these areas? Should there be different levels of protection for the wolves and the livestock in the public lands that are managed by the Bureau of Land Management? There's 155 million acres of public land that is available in the West that is open, that can basically be rented for ranchers to move their cattle through and allow them to graze. And so, this is a holdover from the American West. There's some advantages and disadvantages associated with this, and we'll maybe talk about that in a future ethical dilemma. But there is a situation where we've got lots of public land that is open, where we have the presence of both wolves and the livestock, which is the livelihood of ranchers and ranchers' family, important for the feeding of America and the world. And so should there be different levels of protections in that area? Should we take a look at, on private land? So if, the cattle are on the rancher's own, their rancher's ranch, I guess, say it that way, on the private land, should, the livestock have greater protection at the expense of the wolves? And there are laws in place that say, if you've got a wolf that's attacking the livestock, in many cases you can go through and kill the wolf. Again, various viewpoints on whether or not this has been effective, whether it's doing what it needs to do, if it's been abused in some situations. So lots of concerns with that as well. And then the final ethical dilemma, again, lots of ideas associated with this, so I put a couple in here for this week, is how do you balance the different priorities that need to be considered when making decisions about wolf management? You've got a lot of us scientists. I'm not an environmental scientist. I understand a lot of the concepts associated with it. But you've got environmental scientists that are attempting to restore natural ecosystems and habitats. And they're going to have one viewpoint. You've got ranchers with livestock that are vulnerable to predation. And if they lose livestock, they lose income. And their viewpoint on the wolves is probably going to be very, very different than the environmental scientists. Homeowners in the region that have children and pets that they are, concerned about, Little Red Riding Hood, that their children or their pets are going to be attacked by wolves. Again, very rare occurrence, but it does occur, so what do we need to be doing with that? Hunters seeking new challenges. Many states, at least when the wolves were delisted, would have controlled hunts. They would have a limited number of tags available that hunters would be able to purchase, go out, and again, not baiting or trapping the wolves, but true hunting to find the wolves out in the wild. They have the funds that are available from the selling of these tags to do the hunting. The hunting potentially would, in a proper way, kind of manage the size of the wolf population. Similar way that, on the East Coast, we're looking at hunting of deer to try to manage the levels of deer population and minimize the overgrazing that's occurring out here. So hunters are going to have a view on it that may be different from the ranchers and the environmental scientists. And then finally, an area that I hadn't really considered, but in researching this topic, the concept of ecotourism. There's a vast, not 2020 to 2022, but there have been vast amounts of resources that have gone into the community of Yellowstone and the surrounding areas of people that are going in because they want to see wolves in the wild. They want to experience nature in a somewhat natural setting. And see that. And so again, they have a very different viewpoint than the hunters and potentially the homeowners. And in the process of reading this, I came across this quote, which I think is very telling as we're considering different viewpoints from President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was a livestock rancher. Says farming looks mighty easy when your plow is a pencil and you're 1,000 miles away from the cornfield. It's easy to make these statements. It's easy for me to sit out here on the East Coast and make statements about the wolf population out there in the mountain states of the American West. So, how is it that we go through and balance these different priorities? So, thank you. Hopefully you enjoyed this week's Ethical Dilemma in Science. These are some of the programs I use in doing the research. If you're interested in learning more about this or seeing the information I looked at in preparing this Ethical Dilemma in Science, please see the links below for further information. Thank you and have a great week.